All right, now let's get into episode 4 of Tokyo Vice. I'll start with a quick recap of episode 4 of Tokyo Vice. It begins with Samantha fantasizing about owning her own fancy restaurant, much similar to the one in which she works currently. And she even puts in an offer on one of the buildings that she has found. Jake then gets picked up by the Yakuza and taken to visit the head of the Chihara family, Ishida. Ishida tells Jake that there's a rumor that he's a police informant, meaning Ishida is a police informant, the head of the Chihara gang. And because of that rumor, his men aren't respecting him. He asks Jake then to discover who the informant actually is. And after Jake basically kind of agrees to do that, Sato drives Jake back home, and they have a really funny moment where they talk about the Backstreet Boys song I Want It That Way, which Sato loves and thinks is a lot dirtier than Jake thinks it is, which provides some comedy for everybody, which is good. Jake then talks to Detective Kirigara about the rat in the Chihara gang. Kirigara agrees. Kirigara, if you remember, is played by Ken Watanabe. Kirigara then agrees to find out who the informant really is. Why? Because if Ishida is killed, meaning the head of the Chihara gang is killed, then the Tozawa gang will go to war because the head of the gang won't be very strong. So the Tozawa gang will try to take over, and that'll be a giant mess. And we know that Kirigara is trying to prevent war because it means that the average citizens will have to endure some of the violence from the Yakuza. So one of Kirigara's basic motivations is to keep the gangs from fighting each other. So Jake and his supervisor from the newspaper, Aimi, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, Imi or Aimi, that he convinces her that they should look into the suicides because he thinks that there's something that's happening with the suicides. And they find another similar case from months earlier where another person had committed suicide, and they go to research it, which means they go to a Korean immigrant's home, and his wife was the one who had committed suicide, and they find out who is giving out the loan. So if you remember, we know that there is a lender that is associated with the people who are committing suicide. Well, what we learn here is that as they interview this Korean immigrant, they figure out who's giving out the loans and how that's working. So basically what's happening is this lending company is pressuring people to commit suicide, but we don't know exactly why they're doing that yet. Well, that will be revealed later in this episode. Samantha's boss finds out that she's starting a club, the one that she has already been fantasizing about and put a down payment on, and that she will likely steal his girls. So he has the whole escort service, and she will likely take some of those women and move them into her club. And so then he confronts her, but then he also goes and asks the Yakuza to confront her so that he doesn't have to deal with her competition, basically. Kirigara beats a Tozawa prisoner and gets him to give up the rat that exists within Chihara, the Chihara gang. But we don't know who that rat is. In fact, that won't even be revealed in this particular episode. But he gives that to Jake, and then Jake is able to use that to give back to Ishida. Jake and Aimi then visit the bad lender and discover that the lender forces the borrowers to sign a document as a part of their loan paperwork that turns their life insurance policy over in the event they can't pay the loan. Okay? So when they sign up to get a loan, they also basically sign a document saying that a life insurance policy that was taken out on them will be turned over to the lender if the borrower cannot pay the lender back. Now, this gives us a really good idea of what's happening here. This is why people are committing suicide. This is why the lender is harassing the borrowers who can't pay back to commit suicide. Because if they commit suicide, guess what? If they commit suicide, then the lender gets their money, gets their life insurance policy money. So that's why this is this pretty insane thing to learn about how this is working and how this is going about. We then also see a scene where a private eye is after Samantha based on some crime that she's committed, although we're not told what that is yet. And then we also see a really minor scene where Aimi is, so Jake's boss, is also pursuing another criminal case, but we don't know much about it yet. It has something to do with women who were being killed. So we don't know really too much about that, but we do know that she's actually researching another case on top of the one that she's working on with Jake. Jake and Sato then later go to a club, pick up prostitutes, except Jake doesn't actually realize that they were prostitutes at first until afterwards, and then Sato's pays them, essentially. And then Jake and Sato then go out to dinner at a really nice restaurant, and Jake encounters some of the Tozawa higher-ups. And he actually confronts them in that scene, but it really doesn't go anywhere. Although he does see a couple people. He sees one of the Tozawa accountant and one of the higher ups in the Tozawa gang as well. And so that gives us context for how that situation's kind of working out. The episode then ends with Samantha wondering what to do about her problems. So that's a quick recap of Tokyo Vice episode 4. Now, as a review, my feelings on the episode, I would say that episode 4 was an average episode, which means it was very good. I mean, it was average for this show, and this show is very good. So I do recommend watching this show. Episode 4 was also a really good episode. All the storylines are getting more complicated, especially now with Samantha's storyline slightly changing, because they've given her a reason to be more conflict to be in her life, right? She's now more anxious because this private eye is investigating her or pressuring her, at least at this point. And that's all pretty interesting. I think that's a new twist that's added in that's really compelling. It makes me want to read the memoir of Jake Adelstein's memoir, because I start to wonder if that's how much of this is actually true, because the story's getting pretty complex, pretty complicated. So I thought it was a solid episode that focused on a lot of relationship building and explanation about kind of what's going on. We're still we're moving out of setup mode into what you'd call like the act 2 part of the narrative, where there's lots of conflict. And I think this was a good episode for driving some of that home. The big reveal, obviously, was that the lender was forcing the borrowers to sign a life insurance policy, so that now we know why they were committing suicide, because there was so much societal pressure put on them. And then the lender was harassing them, putting pressure on this guilt and shame honor culture. And so the borrowers felt so bad that they couldn't pay the loans back that they end up committing suicide, so that the lender actually benefits by taking the life insurance policy money. So, which that is a horrific thing to do. I mean, talk about extortion. That's like the epitome of extortion, right? Like, it's really bad. And then, of course, the big twist in this episode was that Samantha is a criminal who's being hunted down by a private eye. And that was, something that I did not really expect to get. So, again, I would say about this episode that it was average, which is very good for Tokyo. I mean, Tokyo Vice is a great show, so definitely something you should watch. And we had some really big reveals, and it looks like we're setting ourselves up for even bigger reveals down the road, which is really fantastic. Now, as far as the breakdown of this episode goes, let's get into that. The first thing to really break down is the reveal that the lender associated with the suicides had the rights to the dead people's life insurance policy payouts. So they get the money if someone dies, and that's why the lender was harassing their borrowers to the point where they were ashamed and they were committing suicide. So this is striking, because as someone who lives in the US, I can't really imagine very many times that this technique would have worked. At least not very often. I don't think this technique would have worked very often on American borrowers. I don't know if we have enough of an honor and shame culture for somebody to harass us to the point where we would commit suicide. Now, I do think that Samantha, as somebody who is an expat American, we see her guilt come up when we realize that a sin she has committed, a crime she has committed, may be found out. So I'm going to get into this later when I talk about kind of this version of noir that we're seeing here that I really like. But that is sort of more of a Western guilt complex. Like, I hide the thing I'm bad at, and if that's revealed, then I'm in big trouble, right? So interesting to see that this technique by these lenders pressuring people to commit suicide. Interesting to see that would work in this culture, because I'm not sure it would work in the Western culture. It may work in some instances, but not as often as it's working here in the show. But again, this is based off Jake Adelstein's actual memoir. So this is likely true. This is likely taken right out of that memoir. I have not read that memoir, but I'm assuming that this case is one of the cases that he pursued as a journalist, and that's what the show is about, because he discovered this about, you know, how the Yakuza was doing this to people. And then, as I talked about with both Mike Gordon and with Dale Wentland, this gets really into honor and shame culture and how that exists in Japan. Again, different than some of the issues that the US would have. These issues are separate because each society has its own ways of behaving. Each society has things about it that are great and things about it that people can manipulate. And in this case, one of the things that's being manipulated is people's ability to pay their debts. And I think this is pretty eye-opening. At least to me it is, right? This is that someone could be this nefarious about this kind of thing is very intense. Very, very intense. Now, this episode also revealed that it's not just Jake who doesn't understand the Japanese culture. Saito and Jake's coworkers, because Jake asked them about I Want It That Way, the song, the Backstreet Boys song I Want It That Way, and what it means. And both Saito and Jake's coworkers all misinterpret that song. It's not about what they think it's about. At least Jake doesn't think it's what they think it's about. It's probably not what they think it's about. They think it's some kind of kinky sex thing. And that's funny. So that's showcased really well with humor, that we may not understand fully Japanese culture, but Japanese culture doesn't actually understand fully Western culture either. And, you know, that's part of what this whole show is playing with. And a lot of shows like this play with similar things.